Hello, I'm Charlie Wolfe, and I will be talking to you today about the spread of COVID-19 based on party control of state governments. The information cutoff date of this presentation is 13 August 2020. The media has indicated that Republicans as a whole are taking COVID-19 less seriously and that the lack of policies or enforcement would increase the spread of COVID-19 across these states. I wanted to see whether the data bore that out. So to start, this is a map of the United States with colors of each state representing the state governor's party and the party's strength within that state. That means that the red is fully Republican, and that the governor is Republican with a Republican legislative body behind him. Blue, solid blue that is Democrat, meaning that the state has a Democrat governor with a Democrat legislative body. The light blue was labeled as a weak Democrat, and that means that it's a Democrat governor, but that the legislative body is Republican. And finally, the light red or pink, whatever you want to call it, represents a weak Republican, meaning that the state has a Republican governor, but a Democrat legislative body behind him. The first chart that we're going to talk about is the 14-day average of positive COVID-19 tests based on per capita status, and then broken into the overall party strength of the governor of each state. So we've already discussed what the various colors mean. So as you look at the original spread of the disease, going back to March when widespread testing was occurring, you'll see that the largest number of increases in the beginning were all Democrat-controlled states. And then right around the 8th of April or so, the spread began to be faster in weak Republican states. The Republican-controlled states stayed fairly low initially, most likely due to the fact that those were low population density states. But then if you look at the point where there's a low point amongst kind of all of the various parties, you'll see that after that, that's when you see the Republican-controlled states with a drastic increase in the spread. So it's peaking right here around the 25th of July, and thankfully now we're starting to see a decrease kind of across the board again. This next chart, one of the things I was wondering was if population density was taken into account, what the spread kind of looked like there. So I normalized this chart based on the density of the various states. Republican-controlled states are generally those states which have a lower population density. So, for example, in South Dakota, enforcing social distancing isn't really required because rather than trying to enforce 6 feet of distance, most people generally have 600 feet of distance. So it's kind of easier to do. So when you normalize the population density, once again, the weak Republican states still have the lowest spread of the disease pretty much throughout the entire range of dates. But these strong Republican states, that's where you start to see huge increases. And once you've normalized here for the population density, you see that the nearest party to them would be the Democrats, who have about 4.5 cases when normalized for population density, vice the Republicans 16.5. So kind of a huge spread there. This next slide, you see that I want to show that testing levels didn't necessarily affect the overall increase. So these are the percentage of positive tests over time. In the beginning, you see that they were basically only testing people that were definitely COVID positive. And then once again around March, early March, March 2nd, March 3rd, most states moved into a larger number of total tests given. So from that point forward, you see this bump up in positive cases right around April, but after that, it all kind of starts to come down. So basically, the more tests that you give, the lower number of positive tests that come back. So right now we're seeing anywhere between a 7 and an 8% kind of test average across the US. This here is just a heat map of the US based on that same 14-day average, but just for the last 14 days. So basically the month of August so far. And this is after you've already seen that kind of, as we talked about earlier, that pop up amongst Republican states. So here you'll see a little bit more geographically how that played out, and that it's spreading much more amongst the southeast portion of the United States. So these southeast states were getting hit definitely the hardest, although the southwest is not faring particularly well either. So you'll see that as far as Democrat bastions, California is getting hit pretty heavily, sitting at that 1381. But it is sitting right next to Arizona, where you're seeing 2557 kind of across that state. I will still argue that likely being California and New York, both on this list, are because of population density. And I say that because LA probably has way more people crammed into it than Mobile, Alabama, or so. So that might account for a lot of the difference here. Just for a kind of different way to look at this, and you see how how they compare to each other. I wanted to break this out in a bubble chart. So once again, just even looking at the bubble sizes, you see that Nevada and Arizona both kind of trump California, but that California and Utah are sitting right about the same. So 1365 for Utah and 1381 for California. Once again, that is normalized for on a per capita status, but not based on population density. So Utah's population density is clearly going to be much less than that of California. So the fact that those numbers are anywhere near close, especially as close as they actually are, kind of speaks to the efficiency of California's policies on the spread of COVID. Overall, I would say that the data shows that the media is likely correct and that the spread is higher in Republican states, but it is kind of relevant that it's only higher in fully Republican states. So the lighter, weak Republican states have actually seen a slightly lesser spread of this disease. These are my sources. I used the COVID data from the Atlantic, and the remainder of my data about the states was pulled directly from the US Census. So the population data that I used was a 2019 estimate based on the 2010 census. So just be aware that those kind of numbers are all estimated. I'd like to thank you for listening to my presentation, and I hope it was helpful.